and thank you for joining us for this very special webinar. My name is Sarah Buchanan, and I am the Ontario Climate Program Manager at Environmental Defence. And this very important community information session about Highway 413 has been coordinated with the help of our many friends in the Stop the 413 community, which includes residents and community groups from across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, who have been working tirelessly to educate and inform and support others to stop Highway 413. I'm sure some of you watching now are from that community, and I just want to take a second to thank you for your work. A little bit about Environmental Defence. We are a leading Canadian advocacy organization, and we work with people, with governments, with industry to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. So today, I know we are all calling in and attending from different locations. And I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land that we're on today, and to learn about the long history of the lands which will be impacted by this highway. This history goes back much farther than settlers like myself learned about in classrooms and in history books. And since we are mainly gathering in Brampton, I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, and the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I want to personally acknowledge I'm calling here from Toronto on the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land, and that we were invited into the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in the spirit of peace and friendship, and also of respect. So we're all grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. As we start this webinar, we should also keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, by climate change, by environmental injustice. If this highway is built, chances are that its impacts will be felt most in these communities, and that's important to keep in mind when we do this work. So today with us, we have three fantastic speakers. We have Brampton Councillor Rowena Santos, who's been an amazing advocate for a new vision for Brampton. We have Peel resident and alternative transportation advocate Rahul Mehta, and Associate Professor of Transportation Geography at the University of Toronto, Stephen Farber. So, hello, everyone.
Hi, good evening. Hi.
Awesome. And so Rahul's going to kick us off tonight with an introduction to the highway, as well as a look at the background of the highway, and what it'll mean for the wider region, and as well as zooming in to take a closer look at what real-world impact would be felt in Brampton specifically. And then we're going to hear from Councillor Santos, who's going to share a vision for how Brampton can grow in a way that encourages vibrant and walkable and low-carbon communities that also lets people get where they need to go without being constantly stuck in traffic. And finally, Steve is going to finish off by giving us his expert look at why building more highways doesn't actually tend to solve congestion, and why this highway in particular is not the answer to Peel's traffic problems. Before we get started, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping and explain how you can interact with us live on the webinar. So if you're joining us live, there's a chat box at the bottom or right of your screen on YouTube. So feel free to type in there, say hello, discuss with each other, and you can also send us your questions and comments there as well. If you're watching this later, or you don't have a YouTube account and can't add questions in the chat box, you can also email your question. Yes, the incredibly archaic technology of email still works. You can email it in to info@stopthe413.ca, and our team is going to be monitoring that archaic email inbox for your questions. And we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session after we go through the short presentations. And I'm going to stress it again, please do ask questions. That's what we're here for, really, is to find out what you want to know and do our best to answer it. So let's get started. I'm going to hand over to Raul, who is a Peel resident, fantastic local advocate of alternative transportation solutions. It's been such a pleasure to be working with him, within the communities who've been engaging with their local councillors, with their local MPPs, with their local MPs, and also remember, if you have any questions at all, you can drop them in the comments or email us at info@environmentaldefense.ca. But for now, I will simply hand it over to you, Raul. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. It's a very kind introduction by you, Sarah. And I'm really grateful to be here and share a bit of background and a bit of personal context to, why does Highway 413 matter to me and why should it matter to you? So let's get started. What exactly will this highway look like? I think many of us are coming at this project now. Some may be quite unfamiliar, some might be fairly well versed. It's a very large project. This highway, Highway 413, also known as GTA West, it's going to be about 60 kilometers long, nearly 200 meters wide. And this is connecting Highway 407 near Milton to Highway 400 near Kleinburg. So you can see here in the map, really, the majority of this highway is actually going to be running through Peel region. The costs have been suggested to start at least $6 billion, although there's now been discussion it may be much higher. And if you're familiar with the 407, the 413 is likely to be a toll highway. If you've heard of this highway before, you might have seen this number that it's estimated the average time savings by the expert review panel that previously quashed this highway would be only 30 to 60 seconds. This highway, many of you may be concerned, of course, running through Caledon, that does indeed mean it's going to go through some of our most valuable and richest farmland, not just in Ontario, but right across the country. That includes areas of Greenbelt, river valleys, and our conservation areas. If we zoom in to Highway 413, you can really see just how much, you could say, undeveloped land, but land that's really being utilized right now, either to provide us with natural goods and services, habitat, or of course, farmland, which is what feeds us with the local food and the fruits and vegetables we desire to have access to, local and close to our cities. The impacts in Caledon, they aren't just isolated to Caledon alone, of course. There are many downstream impacts, and that's something I also wanted to talk about briefly. But of course, if you haven't heard of this highway, it's not the first time we've been in this situation. This is a zombie highway, as many have said. It was actually canceled in 2018 under the previous Liberal government, and by cancellation, we're referring to, of course, the environmental assessment. So it was kind of dead on the water before it arrived. This has since been revived under the current Ford Conservative government, and there's been a proposal for it to be accelerated. So that's through fast tracking and weakening the environmental assessment process just under a year ago. Since then, at the beginning of this year, we've had a request for a federal environmental assessment, something that could provide some additional oversight. And as you're here today, the media coverage, the public interest, and the public concern has grown dramatically since then. We are all familiar with highways, whether we use them or not. Personally, I don't use a highway as much, and they are not quite the solution we desire or we expected. So let's talk a bit more about that. Let's dig into really what is this highway going to mean for us? Well, it's going to mean that some plans we have, some very ambitious plans, as you'll hear from Councillor Santos, might not be possible. Downstream impacts mean places in Brampton and even Mississauga won't be able to realize some of the visions they have to move away from highways and to move towards more focused, dense communities that give people more options. It's not about super tall or super sprawled. It's about giving people choices. So if you've heard of Vision 2040 in Brampton, that might not be possible anymore. What I want to do now is explore a little bit behind why this is important to me. I'm a resident in Mississauga, and this is my home. It used to be mostly farmland, and now it's either single-family homes or tall towers. We don't really have many choices in between. And I like to bike around, but I have to face the reality. This Highway 403, this is also my neighborhood. And it is a major barrier to using the modes of transportation I feel are an essential part of my life: walking, biking, and moving by transit. I look at what we've built in our city and I think about, how do we want to move today and how do we want to move in the future? Is cycling a realistic option for everyone? Definitely not. But should it be a choice that people are able to make? I think so. I also think about, what are my favorite places I want to travel? What are the places I like to see, where I feel comfortable, where I feel less stressed? And do we have those places, those choices in our community? My neighborhood is changing, it's growing, and we're seeing a lot more height. Is that the only option we have? Only height or only sprawled? Is there anything in between? This isn't necessarily my neighborhood, but this is Highway 401, doubled in width, the widest stretch of highway in Canada, now running through Mississauga. And this is what I need to bypass to get on my way to work. And it's not easy, and it's not low stress. You might be able to relate to this. Ultimately, I want to have a comfortable, low stress life, a more sustainable life. And that means giving people choices. It means giving people the opportunity to be able to move in a way that they feel comfortable. To finish things off, I want to leave you with this. It's really not about me. This is me sharing my story briefly, but it's about the generations to come. And when I think about Highway 413, I think about a lost opportunity of having many different modes and how we can move around. So enough about me. What are the impacts to you? What are the changes that might come if Highway 413 is brought forward? Well, so you might be surprised, but you might not if you've ridden in a highway. More traffic is going to come with a highway, and that actually means in the long term, more congestion, more people using cars instead of walking, biking, and using transit to move around. It also means investments are going to be redirected. That $6 billion, it has to come from somewhere, and this is a cost which might not be used as much used in places like our roads, our bridges, our walking and cycling trails, stormwater management ponds, parks, and all of the other amenities we've become used to. This is a question of, what model of planning are we going to follow? What costs are we going to pay in the future? And how much do we want to depend on the car in the years and decades to come? If you zoom out further and look at Peel Region, this is a lot more traffic, and the traffic doesn't just mean more cars and trucks. It also means impacts to our health. It means more carbon and particulate pollution. And this is really concerning to me as someone who has asthma. I don't want to go back to the days of smog when we had coal power. I also don't want to have a hotter city, especially at night, where I have to use my air conditioning. I don't want an enhanced urban heat island effect. All of us certainly can relate to this. We really don't want to see more barriers in how we move around and how we connect with our communities. We don't want boundaries between fresh local food, between our neighbors, or between the places we go to work. Wouldn't it be easier if we had choices in how we could move around? And finally, I'm going to start talking about the alternatives, and you'll hear more about these from our fellow speakers. Could we get more vehicles and trucks on Highway 407? Could we use some of our investment to relieve the tolls or make dedicated lanes for goods movement? Perhaps, if you saw the picture I talked about earlier, that was in South America. Can we build complete communities where you can walk, bike, or use transit to get to where you need to go? Can we build a 15-minute city? And finally, can we plan for future growth in areas where we already have the infrastructure set up? The pipes, the bridges, the roads, the grocery stores, the workplaces, and connect people with improvements rather than brand new additions far flung on the outskirts of our city. Again, this is a question of, do we want to do sprawl, and do we want to depend on only the car for how we move around? There's a lot of ways you can be involved, and I'm so grateful for all of you being here. If you want to show your support, if you want to show that you are opposed to this highway, you can request a lawn sign. I have one in my front yard, and I would love for you to meet with me if you're in the Mississauga area, and I can provide you with a sign. Supporting the media and journalists that have talked about this highway and helped us learn is another great way to show your support, as is speaking up to your elected officials. Finally, I want to share the website, which Environmental Defense has done a great job at coalescing a lot of the resources and information around why this highway is a problem and what you can do about it, as well as learn more up to date. So that's a bit of my background and some of the concerns around Highway 413. I hope that helps you get a better understanding, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Raul. I really appreciate that, and I love seeing all the pictures of you all around town in various places with various modes of transportation. So now I want to shift gears here and introduce Councillor Rowena Santos, who's going to be taking us through the next stage of our presentation. So welcome, Councillor Santos.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this. Hello, Brampton. Hello, everybody watching. I'm Councillor Santos, and for those of you who don't know me, I am an environmental activist. I'm an active transportation activist. I'm a cyclist. I'm a runner, and I do have an electric vehicle most recently. And so when we're talking about the 413, what I did want to share with you is kind of our journey and what we have been through in the city of Brampton as we've navigated through this decision regarding the 413. And to Rahul's point about creating more alternatives for people, that's something that the city of Brampton, through Vision 2040, through our vision, that the residents in 2018, thousands of residents put together. It wasn't the politicians who put that one together. It was the residents who put the Vision 2040 together. And I inherited that as a councillor. And it is now my obligation to make sure that it is implemented. So I'm going to share with you our journey over the past 2 years or so. And I've titled this When Change Can't Wait. Because when we're talking about shifting a culture, when we're talking about climate change and climate action, sometimes those policies, plans, and visions are great on paper, but really it takes implementation, and the implementation must happen now. And the decision around the 413 is an example of why when change can't wait. So as Rahul was sharing, and I'm hoping everyone can see my screen because I can't see you. I can only see my own PowerPoint right now. Somebody let me know if you can't see it. Part of the very first vision in the vision document was about sustainability of the environment. And this is a page. Everything in my presentation are pages taken from public documents and reports from the city of Brampton. And the vision here for sustainability in the environment is that Brampton will become a mosaic of sustainable urban places sitting within an interconnected green park network with its people as environmental stewards, targeting one planet living. And that's exactly what Rahul was illustrating as a local resident who observed what we did with Vision 2040. In that year, in 2019, probably about 6 months into my term as a councillor, I declared a climate emergency, which was unanimously supported by our council. We voted declaring a climate emergency. We were one of the first municipalities in the GTHA to declare a climate emergency. And again, that's in line with the Vision 2040. In July 2019, as many people know, Brampton Transit is one of the fastest growing transit operations with respect to ridership. And in 2019, we announced a milestone related to electric buses and having an electric bus pilot, and received funding for that. Talking about, other alternatives that Rahul was talking about. And next month, we are actually going to be launching this pilot program, the electric bus pilot project itself. In 2019, we unanimously supported as a council the Active Transportation Master Plan, which had aggressive targets to create a more connected network and allow for alternative modes of transportation in the city of Brampton to begin to shift the culture, the car driving culture in our city. Again, another plan that was unanimously supported by council. Now, this is an interesting story. And it's part of this timeline getting to the decision point on the 413. In November 2019, Councillor Vicente and I, my ward councillor partner, some residents were complaining about a blue wall that was being erected on Williams Parkway. Now, the blue wall, the ugly blue wall, people like to call it, was not a decision made by me or Councillor Vicente. It was a decision that we inherited from the last term of council. And when we looked into it more, we did get information that, in fact, it was a noise wall for a 6-lane expansion on Williams Parkway, which is a local road. And we voted in November to pause that expansion because we felt it was inconsistent with the Vision 2040, with the Active Transportation Master Plan, and with the climate declaration, the climate emergency declaration. And so we voted to put a pause on it in 2019. And you can see here again a connection as to why we put a pause on it, because Brampton 2040 Vision specifically says that we will have safe integrated transportation choices and new modes contributing to civic sustainability and emphasizing walking, cycling, and transit. You can see from this chart from Vision 2040 where the priorities should be in terms of creating those alternative modes of transportation outside of the vehicle. So we put a pause on it and took a study. When COVID-19 had happened, we saw this as an opportunity with fewer cars on the road and with a desperate need for more physical distancing on the trails to very quickly implement temporary bike lanes for COVID-19. And this was a pivotal moment for Brampton. It was the first time where we created separated bike lanes, and we did so in a short period of time for COVID-19. And we started the campaign Streets for People. And this was a pivotal moment in terms of shifting the culture away from cars and more towards alternative modes of transportation and sharing the road and creating bike lanes. In September, shortly thereafter in 2020, we unanimously passed the Community Energy and Emissions Reduction Plan at the City of Brampton. And you can see from this slide here at the bottom right corner, transportation represents 60% of the emissions in Brampton. And with the aggressive targets at the bottom of the screen that you can see with the base case year of 2016, and this is after the coal plants were shut down. Many municipalities have their base year targets before the coal plants shut down. These are aggressive targets based on the base year of 2016. In order for us to actually reach these levels, we need to attack that issue on transportation and Brampton's emissions generated by transportation. After the CERP, after the Community Energy Emissions Reduction Plan was voted on unanimously, quite frankly, we had no choice really but to cancel that road expansion on Williams Parkway. The community and the cyclist community, environmental community, David Suzuki Foundation, they sent in petitions to council calling us out on the vision we have, calling us out on the declaration of a climate emergency and all the things that we want to see as the future of Brampton. And we decided to, because of a number of reasons, which Professor Farber is going to share on induced demand, we canceled it. And we got accolades from the community saying, congratulations, that was a very courageous move. And again, another pivotal point for us, and something that set a precedent with relation to the 413. Which gets us to the 413. When we canceled Williams Parkway, with all the arguments that we had to cancel it, there was no way that we could proceed and support the 413. We wanted a different future for the city of Brampton, and some of the decisions we have made these past couple of years would not be able to justify us supporting the 413. And so what are the other alternatives? In terms of planning for the future, similar to the presentation that Raul showed in a city in South America, this is what we see in the future of Brampton. Walkable, connected communities with different modes of transportation where you could live, work, play in a sustainable way. We wanted this and not another highway. And in terms of the future planning for Brampton, this is the option that we wanted to choose, which is the Heritage Heights option, which is one that promotes quality of life, health and well-being, climate mitigation. And this is what is in line with our vision. And so, you know, at the end of the day, Brampton made the right decision. I believe we made the right decision, and there's no looking back. And the future that we are building, that we are creating at the City of Brampton, is one for future generations like my kids and their kids, who are not interested necessarily in seeing congested traffic along the highway. So I'm very excited to share and hear from all of you and answer any questions you may have. That's kind of our journey in a nutshell, when change can't wait, and what we have done very quickly in order to really walk the talk when it comes to the declaration of a climate emergency and maintaining the vision that we have for our city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Santos. It's amazing to see how that, the work that goes into those climate emergency declarations and the organizing and everything that goes into them actually does kind of play out in order to help decision makers like yourself think about, okay, what is the context here? We've declared a climate emergency, and how are we going to make decisions that actually honor that? So it's great to see that policy in action in Brampton. So thank you so much, Councillor Santos, and we're going to go to our next presenter here, who is Associate Professor Stephen Farber, who is an expert in transportation. And a quick reminder, if you do have questions, remember to pop any questions into the comments box. You can also email your question in to info@stopthe413.ca. I know the questions are starting to roll in, and we are going to get to them after we talk to Associate Professor Stephen Farber. Here he is, popping up on my screen. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here. And thanks both to Raul and Councillor Santos for those great presentations. I've learned a lot about the leadership that you've been showing in the region and you're part of the region, and it's really inspiring, and I thank you for it. What I wanted to really do today was introduce you to some of the transportation planning concepts that help transportation planners and like myself and urban planners really try to understand the impacts of new infrastructure like Highway 413 in the region. So I'm calling the lecture Transportation Planning 101, but it's got a subtitle or an alternative title called Why Experts Are Opposed to the 413. And really, if you've done a course in Transportation 101, you don't have to be an expert to understand why we might be opposed to the 413. So actually, each of my slides is going to have this form of the official title and then the subtext, and we'll see if it works. So I want to introduce you all to a really core piece of theory called the transportation land use cycle. The alternative title for this slide is, boy, haven't we been here before? The transportation land use cycle is some core theory that helps us predict and understand how new infrastructure is going to affect the patterns of urbanization, of urban growth over time in a city region like the GTA. And we can start anywhere in the cycle, but let's start over here, and I hope you can see my highlight on the increased traffic bubble. So there's traffic, you look out your window, well, in the before days and growing again, there's traffic out on the roads, and that usually leads to some kind of public call for action to help, the public asks government to help solve these traffic problems. And for the last 70 years or so, the main way that governments have responded to traffic problems is by building new highway infrastructure. So they build new highways, they've expanded highways, and we've been doing this for about 70 years. What happens when that highway is built? In the very short term, we actually see that it is a bit easier for people with cars to get around the city and to access new areas of the region more quickly. And when that land becomes more accessible, like the land along the corridor of a new highway, we see that land values increase. Speculators sell their land to developers. Land gets developed, and all of a sudden there's new people, new businesses, new activities of all sorts taking place along this newly developed corridor. And within a few years, what do you see when you look out the window? You see all sorts of traffic on those roads again. And the public wants to solve the traffic problem, so they ask the government to do something about it. And on, we've repeated this cycle now, over and over again for literally 70 years. So haven't we been here before? Yes, we have absolutely been here before. The arguments being used to support the 413 are the exact same arguments that were used to support the 407, to support the 401, to support all of the numerous widenings of our 400 series highways. In the end, how we haven't ever solved our traffic problem. And the truth is that we can never solve a traffic problem by building new highways. So the short takeaway is, even though advocates will say this will solve traffic problems, those benefits are very short-lived for all of this reason, that over the long run, this cycle predominates those short-run benefits that we see from the highway. And I'm just talking about travel time benefits, not talking about all the costs associated with it. The other thing that people tend not to understand about why highways actually cause more traffic, this being the main reason that it induces more automobile based land development and therefore more trips on the road, but also it makes driving farther more desirable. When there's a widening, when there's a new highway built, all of a sudden people who previously would have found farther away destinations unattractive to travel to, when that new infrastructure is built, we actually, over the long run, make decisions to travel further and further, therefore putting more traffic on the roads overall, and again, eliminating all of those supposed benefits of shortened travel times on the highway. So we can call this type of paradigm the model it and build it paradigm. And it's really something that's been propagated very heavily by this provincial government for the last 70 years. The planning process more or less is focused on trying to understand where growth will occur, predict where traffic is going to be, and then build new highways in order to accommodate that new growth. And it just simply doesn't work. And the main reason that it doesn't work, well, I mean, these are the reasons that it doesn't work. But then what are some alternatives? We really need very badly to shift our emphasis away from trying to fix congestion with a supply solution, with trying to build more capacity to manage traffic. And instead, we really need to be talking about managing the demand for travel. How do we make it so that fewer people actually have the need to travel longer and longer distances on the highway system or in the road system overall? That's actually the only way to break the cycle of automobile dependence. So when we get to this point, public calls for action, which public needs to solve problems and ask for solutions to problems. The solution cannot be build more highway infrastructure. We really need to have a solution that is based on travel demand management, trying to reduce the need for all the use of those highways. And fundamentally, that boils down to getting the right incentives in place to nudge people to use their cars less and to promote alternative means of travel, like the previous two speakers really have spoken about. But I want to highlight a few things that we do very, very badly in this region And by this region, I'm really talking about the GTA and not specifically Brampton. In fact, Brampton's been one of the more innovative places on transit investments of late and so on. I'm really pleased to see it. But let's look at the supply. Let's look at managing the existing road space that we already have so much better. We do an abysmal job in this region of managing the policies of lane usage of the existing roads, meaning we really don't have too many carpool lanes, high occupancy vehicle lanes. We have very few transit priority lanes, and we have really low levels of investment in safe bicycling infrastructure that allow people to, and all of these kind of lane reassignments have the effect of putting the right incentives in the system to allow people and to nudge people to behave more sustainably and to use their cars less, especially those single occupancy vehicles, which are really the things that we're trying to reduce from an environmental standpoint. 2, pricing. I know people want to complain that transportation is expensive, but if you look around OECD countries, if you look around other wealthy nations like Canada, we have nearly the cheapest costs of car-based travel of any country in the world. Of course, the US is slightly cheaper. Australia is something like us. Europe is probably twice as expensive to move around by car. How do they do this? Well, they implement tolls, they have much higher gas taxes, and they have much smarter policies around parking supply, including kind of supply policies around not enforcing an abundance of parking when we develop lands, and also pricing, making sure that there's taxes on parking and levies on parking that increase the costs of using your car. And that's really, of all of the things that we can do, increasing the costs of this unsustainable behavior is the number one way that we can nudge people to travel more sustainably. Councillor Santos showed that 70% or so of emissions are coming from the transportation sector. Making those behaviors that emit those pollutants more expensive is basically the most effective way, the research shows, to do this. And people are going to complain, but we don't have choices. And it's true, we definitely aren't there yet. But we do need to then match any of these revenue generating tools like tolls and gas taxes with really, really substantial investments in alternative modes of travel. And we've looked at also in those other slides, in the other presentations, the integrated transit land use development that really helps us provide alternative living environments that also help foster travel demand management. Okay, the next slide is called Avoiding Policies at Cross Purposes, or Why Can't We Just Do It All? You'll hear from advocates that they say, we love transit, we love cycling, we absolutely agree we need more cycling and we need more transit, but we also need this highway. And the answer is no, it's a complete false equivalence. We don't need to invest in automobiles at the same time as investing in these other transportation modes. And in fact, doing so would completely nullify the investments that we are making in those alternative things like the bike lanes, the transit infrastructure that we are spending billions on. So we really need to pick a policy direction here and stick with it. I have an analogy. This is not to be body shaming in any kind of way, but if we have a public health policy to fight obesity, like we have a public policy to fight automobile dependence and to fight climate change, well, we can't fight obesity and at the same time make unhealthy fast foods cheaper. So similarly, we can't foster and encourage this massive cultural shift that needs to take place to nudge people to travel more sustainably, while also making driving cheaper by building new highways that will foster automobile travel and automobile dependence. So finally, the key takeaways, or the subtitle, yes, this will be on the exam, is one, we are not going to reduce congestion by building more highways. Two, more highways historically has always meant more drivers, more vehicles of car traffic driven, and more traffic on our roads. And three, the only way out of this problem is to invest in better ways to move more people without them becoming the congestion on our roads. So with that, welcome any of your comments and questions, and thanks for the time.
Thanks so much, Steve. And now I will give the exam that Professor Farber mentioned. Just kidding. We're not going to give you an exam.
Oh, I can mock something up quickly.
You ready to do some marking? So we're gonna take the next about 20 minutes of the webinar tonight, and just to answer your questions. And the questions are rolling in, which is awesome. So I'm going to bring in Councillor Santos and Rahul. And we'll have a little chat. So the first questions that, actually, I'm going to direct both of these questions to you, Councillor Santos, and maybe I'll combine two of them into one. One is a really good question. Can a municipality like Brampton vote down the 413? And another question, how do other regional councillors and mayors and councillors in Peel feel about it? Are they doing anything to speak to residents and farmers who might be impacted by this?
And thank you very much for the question. Municipality like Brampton voting down the 413, it's not in our jurisdiction. Ultimately, whatever, even if Brampton says no and the region says no, if the provincial government wants to build the highway, they'll build the highway. Sadly, one of the things that we have said, and part of the reason why Heritage Heights and that particular plan was put in place, was because we thought that was the direction that it was going in. We thought we had no say. And if we had no say, then how do we make sure that we incorporate some piece of a vision like Heritage Heights as part of that project? So that is something we've supported from the very beginning, but ultimately, you know, regardless of what motions we pass, the province will do whatever they want to do. In terms of other regional councillors and how they feel about the 413, we did vote on council to oppose the 413, to have the federal environmental assessment done. So the regional council did vote to oppose it. We voted for the federal assessment as well. And that stance, consistent with other municipalities across the GTHA, was an about face. Like we reversed our original thinking around that decision from the very beginning. In the beginning, people were supportive of the 413 when some of these conversations were happening, and that shifted completely at that one regional council meeting.
And what do you think it was that shifted it? Why did so many municipalities? I mean, we saw Vaughan, we saw Mississauga, Caledon didn't outright oppose it, but they supported the federal EA. I think similar story with Brampton. It wasn't quite a full-on opposition, but it was supporting the federal EA. What turned the tide?
Yeah, I think people are starting to wake up that change can't wait anymore. You know, when you call a climate emergency, people like Rahul, people like Professor Farber, people like Environmental Defense, many of the residents who are listening now, they will call it out and they will voice their opinion. And a lot of the people who are calling it out are the folks who are going to be the ones living in these communities and raising their kids here. And so their vision and their opinion matters, because the decisions that we make, whether that's a highway or bike lanes or whatever, it's going to impact them. I'm going to be old and gray and some sort of like living in the basement of my son's house by the time anything gets built, right? So the decisions we make, I think that's where it came from, is that added pressure and that type of thinking, which is great for the movement.
Yeah. And speaking of the movement, this is a question really for anybody who wants to pick it up. What precise, specific, strategic measures need to happen to stop the highway from being built? And I'm thinking this is kind of a campaign question. Like, what do we need to do to, amplify these voices even more and get the word out about the impacts of this highway? Rahul, maybe I'll start with you. Just speaking from your experience as someone active on this, what are we doing, and what more do we need to do to stop this thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is at times a sense of maybe apathy among young people, or helplessness for those that are engaged. And we feel like our voices aren't being heard by our elected officials or by policymakers. But, we've started to see that really change with things like rising voting records, right? A larger number of youth, more than ever actually, are now voting at all levels of government. And we're starting to recognize that we are in many cases, in many parts of the country, the largest voting bloc, and that there is a great deal we need to think about, forward future planning. Just like Councillor Santos has spoken to, right? What is the future going to look like? And so I think really this is the stress test for young people, right? Managing the burdens we already face and thinking about, what do we want the future to be? Do we want it to be more stressful? But it's also a stress test for government, right? What government decisions are untenable positions, right? And how will the voters respond? So I think for any young people listening, you have great agency, and you have great power, not just in your vote, but in the conversations you're having and the pressure you are putting on your elected officials. They are listening.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to add here that it's sometimes not just only about opposing something. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's about making sure that all of us support the change that's happening now. I get a lot of still opposition to the bike lanes. We get a lot of opposition to some other things that are required to implement Vision 2040, whether that's more intensification or whether that's more trees or what have you. And sometimes we need help. I need help to highlight the positive changes that are happening, because those naysayers who don't believe, or who still believe that the car is the only way, they don't believe that people are using the bike lanes. They don't believe that people are taking transit. They believe that you still need a car. And so we need to prove that that's not the case. And so it's not just necessarily about opposition, it's about supporting the change that's happening on the ground.
That's a great segue into the next audience question here, which is, how do we shift this narrative that cars are superior to other modes of transportation? How do we shift the narrative to supporting those alternatives and seeing them on a level playing field? Professor Farber, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, automobile supremacy, say, is so fundamentally baked into our society and to our urban form that it is to the point where really being able to make people forget about its supremacy is through more progressive pricing of automobile-based travel. So I really think that pricing is key here, and there's a huge tactical question about, can we implement pricing before the cultural shift takes place? Like, at what point will toll roads and congestion charging and increased gas taxes become politically acceptable? Or are those things needed in order for it to become politically acceptable? There's a bit of a chicken and an egg issue. So I don't mean to dance around it. It's a hugely difficult challenge, and I do think that that we have the technologies to do more sophisticated things. We have great policy examples from all over the world, evidence showing that it works. We have the ability to run pilots. We really need to start thinking about implementing these things. And we should be looking to Vancouver, I think, over the next few years. This isn't an immediate question about the 413, but coming out of their climate crisis just this summer, or sorry, I can't keep track. It was maybe last fall. When they announced their climate crisis, one of the first things that they approved the city to do was to make a 5-year plan to prepare the city for new forms of congestion pricing and charging drivers for the use of the roads. And I think that it's going to be a shining example, actually, if for how we can do that within a Canadian city, and it's quite promising.
And Rahul, I know part of your work involves getting people into alternative modes of transportation. What's your secret? What's your tip for for using the carrot rather than the stick? I guess we've heard from Stephen about how to use the stick of congestion pricing. What's the carrot? What's the incentive?
Yeah, that's interesting. So my work, I really have the great privilege to work with newcomers with a settlement agency here in Mississauga, Peel Multicultural Council, and we're providing bikes for free in the form of a mentorship program. So we're really trying to break through that car supremacy concept and culture that is immediately imposed on you, really, once you're coming into, quote unquote, the Western world or the society that we have designed here. Many just don't see it as a realistic option in how to move around. But once they try it, well, two things happen. They might not still see it as an option, but they start to question why it's not an option. And when they have access to it, they begin to see, well, how can I actually make this as a piece of the puzzle? How can I use this to do something like the last mile or first mile, you could say kilometer, I should say. How can I use it to connect my destinations? We know so many car trips are happening in the 5 kilometer or less, or 15-minute drive or less. That could be easily achieved by walking, biking, or taking transit. But there is this barrier of many often don't start there. And once they don't start there, they don't go back or they don't try it. So I think for many who are in this space, we aren't providing those basic incentives, bike share, mentorship, ease of access to the facilities we need, right? So protected bike lanes, even if it is a pilot during COVID, right? Brampton has given that example and other cities have followed suit. Toronto has done a great job there. And it's really giving people that option of, oh, this is something here. This is new. Why is the government investing in this? Maybe I should try it. And I can then provide feedback on, do I want more or do I want it different? And for the participants in my program, they keep coming back and they don't just want to ride their bike now. They want to be the next mentor to someone a newcomer coming in the next year. So for me, that really validates this opportunity of it's learning, it's growth, and it's community once we start giving people these choices on how to move.
Yeah, last week at council, I brought forward another motion related to active transportation, and the motion was about making sure that the city of Brampton, through our corporation, incentivizes staff to use active transportation. And that, we have thousands of employees in the city of Brampton, and in working with Bike Brampton, as well as the Cycling Advisory Committee, we thought to ourselves, we're building all this infrastructure, but in order to shift that culture, we need people to use it. And what better way than to lead by example through the city of Brampton staff? And so that motion was unanimously passed by council. And now we are working on, I just had a meeting today with David and Dale Lang, talking about what types of incentives we could put, including education programs, CAN-based programs, etc., to encourage city staff to use active transportation.
Awesome. We've got a few more questions rolling in here, and I know we've only got 5 minutes left, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. A reminder again, you can still pop your questions into that chat box or email them in at info@stopthe413.ca. There's a couple of questions about the environmental assessment processes. There's many of them. What's going on? Are they still happening? Who's involved? So I just want to give a quick clarification on what is happening there. So there's a provincial environmental assessment of this highway, and basically the province is the level of government that is proposing the highway and planning to build it. So they are also assessing what impacts this highway would have on the environment, things like our water systems and air and trees and forests and things like that. And so the province has actually proposed, in order to speed up building this highway, they proposed weakening that process considerably, and they did that back in August, and it seemed like they were trying to do it when no one was looking and everyone was paying attention to the pandemic, and they kind of tried to put through this policy saying, actually, we're going to do a whole lot shorter of an environmental assessment for this to get shovels in the ground. And so coming out of that, us and some other organizations actually asked the federal government if they could step in and do a federal assessment, an impact assessment, to get the federal government to look at what would be the impacts of this highway and do a much more thorough investigation of it. So that's what's going on with all the different levels of government and their assessments. Basically, the province was seeming like they were going to be pretty negligent in their duties in assessing the impacts of this highway. So we've asked the federal government to intervene, and they are just deciding right now whether or not to do that. We expect there will be an announcement in the next couple weeks on that. So we should know quite soon. And so that's why you might, if you're on our email list in environmental defense, you might be getting an email saying, reach out to your MPP. No, reach out to your MP. Reach out to your councillor. So if you're a politician in the GTA West region, you have heard about this highway. And so we've covered all levels. And so I want to go to one more question here, at least. Question is, your words need to reach many more people. How do you plan on continuing to advertise the need to abolish this highway in our communities? I guess that's a big question. We are with folks who live in the region. We have a group that meets regularly, and honestly, if there are folks who are listening to this webinar and want to join us, it's just basically a group of people who care and live near the proposed route of the highway. You can email info@stopthe413.ca, go to our website, find it that way, and you can help us spread the word. Talk to your neighbors about it. Talk to your local elected officials. Write into your local papers with letters to the editor. Put up a lawn sign. So there's tons of stuff that you can do. Any other thoughts on how to get the word out from anyone else on this panel?
I'm just going to say that, it's to your point that we are the four of us, and the other folks who are, I would call them the hacks on this issue, we're only a few people. And so the more conversations that those who are watching right now have with others to help be the messengers on how we change the culture in order to truly take climate action, in order to truly walk the talk when it comes to the climate emergency declaration. We need you to be the messengers. We have to kind of stop preaching to the choir all the time. And we have to start changing minds of those car obsessed drivers to let them know that it is important to share the road. And these are the actions that we need to take in the future.
I'll quickly jump in, just two things. Can't emphasize enough, support good journalism, support your local journalists. The Pointer in Mississauga and Brampton have done an incredible job on deep dives on this issue. So learning opportunities continue well past this webinar. And yeah, have those conversations. Think about what your frustrations are around every mode of travel, be it cars, bikes, or transit, and ask yourself, why is it a problem? And what are your policymakers, your elected officials doing about it?
And that's a great segue into my closing call to action here, because it is the end of our time. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, for your thoughtful questions. But yeah, probably the most important action everyone can take is to email or call your local MPP, your member of provincial parliament, because the province is the one making the biggest decision on this, and to email or call the Minister of Transportation, Caroline Mulroney. So let them know you don't support this highway, there are better ways to move people and goods in the GTHA, and you want to see those alternatives supported. And we're also providing lawn signs to residents who want to show that they oppose the highway. And there's a slide here that tells you exactly how to request a lawn sign. You can put it up, if you don't have a lawn, you can put it up in your window. You can attach it to your bike like someone did a few weeks ago. They rode the entire route of the highway with like the lawn signs attached to their bike, which was heroic to say the least. So you can do that too if you order your own lawn sign here. And so, you know, in addition to doing all those things, you can also just listen to this webinar over and over again on YouTube to learn more and share it with your friends and with your neighbors as well. I want to give a special thank you to our speakers, to Councillor Santos, to Rahul Mehta, and to Stephen Farber for their expertise and their insights today. And of course, thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.